Welcome back to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival here at Diggy Palace front lawn, protected by Dettol. Our session today, Battle of Belonging, Shashi Tharoor in conversation with Faye D'Souza. What does it mean to be Indian? Politician and celebrated author Shashi Tharoor's latest book, The Battle of Belonging, on nationalism, patriotism, and what it means to be Indian, evaluates the historical and current political trends impacting the idea of India. Tharoor explores these changing interpretations of nationalism, patriotism, citizenship, and belonging, as well as the nature and future of nationhood. In an important conversation with journalist Faye D'Souza, he discusses these themes and ideas in the context of the past, the present, and the emergent future. Dr. Shashi Tharoor is an author, politician, and former international civil servant, currently a third-term Lok Sabha Member of Parliament representing the Thiruvananthapuram constituency. He also chairs the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology. During his nearly 3 decades-long prior career at the United Nations, he served as a peacekeeper, refugee worker, and administrator at the highest levels, serving as Under Secretary General during Kofi Annan's leadership of the United Nations. He is also an award-winning author of over 20 books of both fiction as well as non-fiction, including The Great Indian Novel and The New World Disorder. Dr. Tharoor's 22nd book is titled The Battle of Belonging. Faye D'Souza is an award-winning journalist who has changed the way news is covered on Indian television by focusing on the issues that matter to the citizens rather than those that fuel the emotions of partisan debates. D'Souza was the executive editor of Mirror Now. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section below. Ladies and gentlemen, The Battle of Belonging, Shashi Tharoor in conversation with Faye D'Souza.
Mr. Tharoor, good evening, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Faye. Not at all generous. I think you're the best thing one can see on the small screen.
See, now that is generous. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to have this conversation. I do miss the environment around Jaipur and the Lit Fest that, and the fabric and the conversation that we would normally have the 2-day break to enjoy. But unfortunately, this year, everything's going to have to happen online. But these are difficult times. It did give me a chance to read the book, though, which is extremely interesting. And what was even more interesting is as I read the book, the news around us seemed to develop around the arguments that you were making in the book as well. So I think that it's an interesting time to have this conversation. For our audience who has not read the book, The Battle of Belonging basically examines the idea of patriotism, nationalism, what it's like to belong to a country. And what does that mean? Does it have to do with your race? Does it have to do with your language? Does it have to do with some sort of shared identity? And where patriotism comes in. So do you feel that kinship to the race, to the religion, to the identity, or to the idea of the country itself? Ironically, while we have this conversation, while this conversation is being put together, Mr. Shashi Tharoor himself is facing multiple FIRs for sedition, which by definition is a crime against the state. It's a crime against the nation. And we'll also take a look at what's happening with dissent altogether and how have we reached a point where disagreeing or dissent is being looked at as anti-national. So does that make you less patriotic in some way, or does it hurt the identity of who we are? Before we get into the thick of discussing what's going on around us, Mr. Tharoor, the book very interestingly places before the audience your own history of where you were born, where you grew up, and how that affects your identity. I don't believe you've written about this in the past before. You haven't been, you weren't born in India. And
that's right.
You've given up multiple options of different, nationalities and other passports, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I was born in the UK, and my parents moved here when I was 2.5. So the initial choice was theirs. They saw themselves as Indian. They came back to an India relatively just a decade after independence, a decade and a bit. So they saw themselves part of this great, exciting adventure of independent India. But I, by virtue of birth, particularly at that time, and to non-diplomatic parents, I have the entitlement to a British passport, which is in fact something that even tomorrow I could exercise, and have repeatedly been invited to exercise and have consistently refused. And I talk about some of the reasons in the book. I also, of course, spent the bulk of my adult life abroad. When I turned 50, I think I had essentially spent 34 years living in foreign countries. And since the last 18 of those had been in the US, purely on terms of longevity, I could have gone the green card route fairly routinely upon my departure from the UN, but I chose not to. I made a conscious decision to come back, as my parents had, as my father had. And I must say that I'm acutely conscious that in his case, he regretted that decision after some years, as India took a certain direction that in economic terms left people like him, the salaried middle class, feeling rather frustrated. In my case, that's not my problem. My problem is much more that the India I came back to serve through entry into politics and public life has been or is still in the process of being pushed and shaped and shoveled into something that it was never meant to be, according to its own constitution, which enshrined a notion of Indian nationhood that emerged from the freedom struggle. So this book, in many ways, is an exploration of all those fundamental issues, Faye. It's what's Indian nationhood all about, starting indeed with the way I feel Indian, why I feel Indian, but also what anyone in this country, irrespective of their caste, their creed, their language, their region, their place of birth, is entitled to feel under the provisions of our constitution. But those are provisions that are fundamentally challenged in spirit, in context, and increasingly in daily practice by the ruling forces in our country today. So in many ways, it's both a very contemporary book. It's semi-autobiographical, yet it's semi-theoretical, because I talk about the evolution of the concept of nationhood worldwide before I bring it down to India. It's partly sort of constitutional theory, because I discuss the nature of the constitution and its application and evolution, and it's partially sheer straightforward politics, because the events of the last 6 years figure very strongly in the final third of the book. So you've got all of these things, and it's a book that I hope people are engaged with the concerns, the issues of our contemporary debates politically will find as interesting as those who are more scholarly and are interested in the conceptual arguments about nationalism, patriotism, nationhood, and so on. It's all there.
Well, if I may just go down this road a little more, where you've argued in this book the idea of nationalism with varied examples, not Indian examples. You talked about how Pakistan tried to tie East and West Pakistan with religion, but it didn't work because they had separate languages. You talked about an individual who was Dutch but didn't look Dutch, and how, just race or just religion or just language is very often inadequate to tie people together in that fashion, or to have them root together in that fashion. Why do you feel Indian? Okay,
so let me first dial that little back to your question before I answer the final thrust of it, the first part of your question, because essentially there are, in my analysis, everything can be reduced to two broad kinds of nationalism. I do describe there are various theories of nationalism. There are at least 9 different concepts I could break down and describe, like religious nationalism, territorial nationalism, revolutionary nationalism, linguistic nationalism, and so on. But at the end of the day, I say, if you really boil it down, there are two kinds. There's one kind which is anchored in questions of identity, immutable features into which you are essentially born. It could be, of course, your race or ethnicity. It could be your language. It could be your religion. It could be the place of birth, and so on, that ultimately make up who you are in that sense of nationhood. So identity nationalism. And then you've got a nationalism that is not at all linked to any of these ethnic, religious, linguistic factors, but is linked to constitutions and institutions. And that is called civic nationalism. And the Indian constitution essentially took our anti-colonial nationalism, which obviously had strong ethnic elements in it, because we're basically saying to the Brits, you are not like us, you're foreigners, you get out, we're going to throw you out and assert our freedom. So there's a strongly sort of ethnic concept there. But then for 3 years, they debated back and forth what our nationhood was, and they actually went for civic nationalism in the constitution, where it didn't matter what your religion, language, etc. were. All that mattered was that once you were Indian under this constitution, you had completely equal rights. Somebody actually raised in the Constituent Assembly the question that has popped up again now, which is, since Pakistan has been created as a nation for India's Muslims, should we not declare ourselves to be a nation for India's Hindus? And it was overwhelmingly rejected by the educated, passionate nationalists who debated in the Constituent Assembly and said, no, our freedom struggle was for everyone, and therefore we will establish a country with a constitution that protects everyone. And this is indeed the very reason why the Hindutva movement of that time, people like Savarkar and Golwalkar, rejected the constitution. And there's some very good writings, or very lucid writings by both of them, and subsequently by Deen Dayal Upadhyay, whom the RSS had sent off to found or lead eventually the Bharatiya Jansangh, which is the forerunner of the BJP. And Upadhyay is somebody who Mr. Modi hailed in his first year in office as his intellectual guru and his political guru. They all said, this is a flawed idea. They said, the Constitution seems to assume that a nation called India is a territory called India, and therefore the Constitution must be written for all the people on it. Wrong, they say. A nation is not a territory, a nation is a people, and the people of India are only the Hindu people. Now that's, as you can imagine, as far different a premise as you can get from the civic nationalist premise. And it was always a very small minority idea until in the last 25 years, it began its seemingly inexorable rise to power in our country. And now in the last 6 years, those who are in power are actively disseminating this idea, passing laws that reflect this idea, imposing practices, slogans, rhetorical constructs, which are all based on a set of assumptions that were not held by our founding fathers and mothers when they wrote the Constitution.
May I argue this? Within the group of our founding parents, there were those, you said it was a minority that believed that India should be a Hindu nation. But if we looked at the entire country, could it be possible that the founding parents who believed in a secular nation were in fact the minority? Could it be argued that the larger country wanted to be Hindu, and this was just some people in a particular group who intellectually sort of force fit the idea of a secular nation?
Well, first of all, there was no force. It was very democratically debated and extensively, which is why the Constituent Assembly debates are so much worth reading. I have so thoroughly enjoyed dipping into them. They are an absolute delight. They go on for 3 years, and they go on at some length and with a lot of erudition, some anger, some wit, a lot of passion. It's fabulous. I've got some quotes from the debates in the book. But the fact is that no one forced anything on anybody. There was a free-for-all intellectually in debating all these points of view. And remember, we had Muslims, Hindus, Parsis, Christians, everybody in the Constituent Assembly. No community of any significance was left out. There was even one tribal, which would surprise people who said, oh, this Constituent Assembly was a bunch of elites, it wasn't totally represented. No, I mean, pretty much all segments of Indian opinion. Of course, the educated ones amongst them, in a country which only had 13% literacy, you already have some self-selection right there. But still, all identities were reflected in the assembly. So no one forced it. Secondly, India, by and large, was not a communal country. I would argue that the consciousness of religious divides was actively instilled by British rule. I've argued this at length in my book, An Era of Darkness, and I have gone on to say that if you look at the actual mechanics of what finally made partition inevitable, it all really unraveled between 42 and 47. Until then, partition was far from inevitable. The partition riots were not even on the calendar. Everything suddenly happened in a 5-year span that destroyed the unity of the country. And you can say, well, that wasn't worth very much if it could be destroyed in 5 years. Well, history sometimes works that way. It takes the igniting of a spark in certain favorable circumstances for a minority idea to briefly seize the imagination of the nation. But whatever happened, I would argue that even if you look at the riots of partition, they were confined essentially to Punjab and Bengal. And of course, Delhi a little bit. But it's not as if every part of India was up in flames and Hindus are butchering Muslims everywhere. And Sikhs, for that matter, were also caught up in Punjab. in many, many parts of the country, life went on as before. And that's something people don't fully understand. There were no partition riots in Bombay, where you're sitting. There certainly were none in Kerala, which I represent in Parliament. So I can say that not all the nation was communalized in the way that people with perhaps a vivid experience or even memory of 47 tend to think.
So would you then argue that, right now, and this is the point at which our country is currently standing in the history that's being written as we speak, that we're changing perhaps from a nationalism of shared duty and shared sorrow, as you pointed out in your book, to a nationalism of identity. Because, and I love the idea of a nationalism of shared sorrow, where basically, another Indian's pain is also my pain, and there is a duty there, from being born in this country to find ways to relieve the pain of our fellow citizens. But we're now moving very quickly into an idea that unless you fall into this category of, and you've said Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan, I'll take it one step further. I'd say male, upper caste, Hindu, vegetarian, Hindi speaking, unless you are in this entire category, heterosexual also, you are left out. You have to find a way to conform in idea and in representation and response. Is that the transition that we're seeing right now?
It's a worrying prospect, isn't it? No, there certainly is. I'm sorry to say, a delegitimization of dissent, as some people who are in power today are essentially focusing on the idea that if you don't agree with them, you are anti-national, so that the entire category of whether you belong to the nation, have a claim on it, is conflated with the extent of your willingness to support the government and to conform to its idea of how you should be as a person. So I do very much worry about all this, because, when the handful of intellectual critics on that side of the fence say to me, oh, Shashi Tharoor acts or writes as if India was only born in 1947. We're actually an ancient civilization. I turn around and say, actually, I've written for years that we're an ancient civilization. But I believe that our time-honored civilizational traditions are those of inclusivity, of social justice, of religious tolerance, even more acceptance of difference, and the desire to forge a society that allowed people to flourish, irrespective of their religion, caste, language, and so on. And so my argument is that what you're doing, I beg your pardon, Faye, for saying that what they're doing now is an exclusionary, aggressive, and communal nationalism based on a very narrow and, I would argue, distorted view of India's cultural identity as a Hindu Rashtra. So that troubles me a lot. Patriotism, as I describe it in the book, is simply just about loving your country the way you love your mother. You love your country because it's yours, because you belong to it and it belongs to you. And that kind of patriotism excludes no Indian. Anybody, whether you're a Mizo, a Muslim, a Malayali, a Kashmiri, doesn't matter. You feel a certain sense of identification with your country. It manifests itself certainly every time India plays a cricket match, but it's also part of your feeling about your nation. It excludes nobody. Whereas the nationalism being promoted in India today is a totalizing vision that omits those who don't fit in within its terms or who refuse to subscribe to their ideas. It demands allegiance, it brooks no dissent. That's the problem.
You also talked about how there is a sort of either crushing of dissent or removal of dissenters from institutions of education, from institutions of research, from institutions of government, to sort of create a sort of homogeneous group of yes men who are doing the bidding of government. And I want to take the question one step past the book. What do you think the result of this is going to be if it continues for a few more years?
Well, it is unfortunately heading in a direction that would be essentially anti-democratic, because ultimately, if you argue that opposition and dissent are by definition anti-national, then your fear of anti-nationalism becomes itself anti-nationalist, because you are opposing the democracy with which our nationalism is inextricably linked. The attack on dissent is an attack on democracy. And the fear that many have, and I've echoed in the book, is that ethno-nationalism of this kind is taking India towards a peculiar hybrid, a sort of dictatocracy, which preserves the forms of democracy while brooking no dissent against its dictates. So that would be my answer to you. I think we may be heading, if we continue like this, into a dictatocracy rather than a democracy.
Apart from within the institutions of government, dissent normally also comes in from citizen protest, and we're seeing a reaction to that. It comes in art, in film, in books, among journalists and things that are written and covered across the country. Is there also, and we're seeing a lot of this hurt religious sentiment turning into arrests, turning into FIRs. Is that also, in your opinion, part of this attempt to crush that dissent and have everybody sort of agree with everything that's going on?
I'm afraid it is. And the irony is they don't really need it. In other words, you can advocate a different form of nationalism legitimately and put it up for grabs through democratic contestation. And of course, you're doing rather well. In other words, you are doing well enough right now by winning election after election, not just nationally, but in the states. Why do you need to curb dissent? Put it out there as an idea. In fact, one of the ironies is that this is a government that is desperately anxious to enjoy international approbation. They want, for example, as more and more Western countries, fearful of China's rise, are anxious to create and shore up their defenses through the creation of a community of democracies. Boris Johnson's already expanding the G7 to a G10 this year. Biden announced during the election campaign that one of his first actions in his first few months in office would be to call a summit of democracies. Now, at that time, is this a great idea because of your petty political objectives at home to demonstrate to the rest of the world that you are becoming less and less democratic, that you are curbing dissent, muzzling opposition voices, putting FIRs against journalists? I mean, I frankly, I'm bewildered that the government would so comprehensively shoot itself in the foot. Why would they do that? I mean, it seems to me it's because, as I argued, their vision is a totalizing vision. It admits no dissent. You see, I mean, if you and I say that our view of India is our view and they are entitled to their own view, that's one thing. They could say the same thing in reverse. But what they're saying is our view is the only view. And if you don't subscribe to it, you're going to be crushed, arrested, harassed, censored, whatever. Now, that, unfortunately, is not democracy. It's not democratic. And by going against democracy, it's going against the fundamental tenets and spirit of the Constitution that established who we were back in 1950.
As a member of Parliament, do you see the possibility of the Constitution being altered or changed?
You know, the worrying thing is they seem to be able to do an awful lot without actually having to alter it. They have an undeclared emergency going on in this country, as many have observed, in that they don't need to suspend any laws. They just have to apply them in a certain way. And with the cooperation of judges, you can do that. So we have looked at a number of situations in which the selective application of elements of the Constitution enables the government to do all the things that you and I are sitting here bemoaning or decrying right now. They're being done anyway, and no one's had to significantly amend the Constitution. They have brought in a few laws like the UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is pretty draconian, which has also been applied to me, I understand, from the media. They've obviously tried to give a lot of teeth to the Sedition Act, which the Supreme Court had, as far back as 1962, read down as only applying to actual direct incitement to violence. So it seems very surprising and rather difficult to believe that you're looking at a country which actually has a tradition of interpreting the Constitution in a very liberal sense. The same Constitution is being applied illiberally without needing to rewrite it.
Well, I must ask you this. There is also an attempt by many opposition parties, especially during elections, including our own, to sort of assert its own Hindu-ness. Does that in some way lend an echo to what is already being said, that India, that you have to be Hindu in order to occupy public space in India, and if those people who are not part of that conformist box need to find themselves in the shadows, or will find themselves in the shadows eventually?
As far as my party is concerned, I think we clearly understand the difference between Hinduism and Hindutva. I think every individual member of ours who happens to be Hindu is free to avow his personal Hinduism. And someone like me who goes to temples equally avidly goes in my constituency to churches and mosques, because it's a way of showing respect for my voters, my constituents. And I think it's perfectly valid to do that. And I do it all the time. And so do most politicians in democratic India. We've always interpreted secularism not to mean distancing from religion, but to actually encourage the flourishing of a proliferation of religion. So I don't think that in and of itself is a problem. The problem would be if it's one religion to the exclusion of all others, and if it implies endorsement of an interpretation of the national identity that suggests that that identity is somehow only Hindu. That's first of all unconstitutional to suggest, and secondly, it flies in the face of established realities. Now, in my case, I live in this. I mean, I seek votes and political support in a state where visibly around me, the minorities don't have a minority complex. No Kerala Christian or Kerala Muslim thinks of himself or herself as being in any way different from the Kerala Hindu. So perhaps my task is easier because the assumption of the people around them is that we are Malayalis, we have a certain culture, we have a long history, we've lived together for thousands of years. We're not going to let these guys poison our minds. Yes, there is a small percent. The BJP's vote share has been gradually climbing. It's gone up from somewhere around 6 or 7% to more like 13 or 14%. But we're still talking about the overwhelming majority of Keralites who don't believe in communal thinking. Now, I recognize that is less true in other parts of the country, and that political parties in crafting their vote-getting appeals feel obliged in some places to tailor their message differently. You could also argue that in some Muslim-dominated constituencies, they tailor their message entirely towards appealing to that kind of vote. So it's part of the political game. I think what's more important is doctrine, credo, manifesto, and frankly, action in office if they win power, than worrying about whether some candidate is overtly demonstrating a religious affinity or whatever, because vote seeking implies a lot of things which will vary from place to place in our country.
You know, again, I was reminded in school, we're taught unity and diversity. That phrase pops up a lot when we're in school. It's sort of drilled into our heads. And you have also noted in the book how different India is in terms of language, in terms of race, even in terms of even how we look. So you've mentioned how a Brahmin Hindu in Tamil Nadu perhaps has more in common with their Christian or Muslim counterpart in the same state than a Brahmin in, say, Himachal Pradesh or Uttar Pradesh. But the question then comes into what then unites us. Is there a need for uniformity or some sort of shared identity in order to bring in unity? Can the idea of territory be enough to unite us? Or is it cricket? Is it Bollywood? What is it going to be?
That's the civic nationalism bit coming right there, Faye, because I'm basically saying what unites us is the Constitution and the institutions we all have in common, plus a shared sense of civilizational oneness, which frankly has emerged from the ancient times, has been sanctified by shared history and historical experiences, and of course is reflected in our geography. I mean, ideally, it would have been the Himalayas and the seas that encompass that common historical space. 20th century politics took away Pakistan and Bangladesh from that conception. But otherwise, it's essentially the same old notion of India that goes back to the days of Alexander the Great and the Persians. So you're looking at a time when really India today is all of those things. It is an ancient civilization. It is a broadly recognizable geographical space with a bunch of ethnicities within it, but ultimately it's held together by our liberal constitution, by our pluralist democracy, and by the institutions and practices that we've lived with since 1947 and 1950, particularly the Constitution. Now that's my view. Now you ask, should there be unity? Wouldn't that be a good thing? I'm all in favor of unity, but I'm not in favor of uniformity. And that's the big difference. You see, I've got this little argument in the book between me and the RSS chief Mohan Bhagwat, where I talk about unity in diversity, and he talks about diversity in unity. Now, what do we mean by those two terms? I'm talking about what I described almost 25 years ago now in America, more than 25 years ago now in America, as my Thali theory of Indian nationalism, that we are not a melting pot as the Americans are. We are a collection of different dishes on one platter. Each dish belongs in a separate bowl and doesn't necessarily flow into the next, but they belong together on the same plate and they combine together on your palate to give you a satisfying meal. That's the thali. So you have all this diversity, but they stay together in one platter. Whereas Mr. Bhagwat's, I beg your pardon?
Is the thali vegetarian?
For me it is, but it doesn't have to be. Every good restaurant will give you a non-veg thali as well. But the point is that in the case of Mr. Bhagwat, he really speaks of diversity and unity, that he wants a united notion of Indian nationhood, a sort of khichdi, ideally a kind of saffron khichdi into which everyone is stirred together. Now, a little lump of aloo might stick out, and a little gajar here and there that stick out and claim to be slightly different, but they all belong inside the same khichdi mess, and they're all eaten together, and ultimately that saffron khichdi is who we are. So that is, for me, a fundamentally different concept. Now, I'm perfectly happy to entertain both concepts in a democratic contention. I'm not happy to be told that my concept is unacceptable and the only way we can be an Indian nation is in the saffron khichdi format. That's where the problems start.
But the argument, and I've heard, and I'm bringing this up because I have heard people make this argument to me, saying that, you know what, everybody seems to have their own country. People of, certain religions have their own sense of belonging, which again echoes what you say in the book. So since Indians are Hindu and the Hindu religion originates territorially in India, why can't this be a Hindu nation that then gives equal rights to everybody? What is the problem there? What is the risk if we do that?
There is, in fact, a surprising piece I've cited by a Muslim constitutional scholar, Faizan Mustafa, who actually argues precisely what you've just asked. I didn't know how serious he was, but if he was serious, I would consider it an abject surrender, because, you see, it's one thing if we had started off that way, the way in which Nepal started off as a Hindu monarchy and kind of accommodated others later, or Japan started off very much as a monocultural state and is gradually discussing how to come to terms with others. In the case of India, modern India was established with a constitution that started off with the premise that no one religion would dominate and that all citizens would be equal. Now, if you suddenly reverse, that reversal becomes essentially a repudiation of the ideas inherent in the original. So if we had been, for argument's sake, a Hindu kingdom before, it was defensible. We weren't. I mean, before 1857, we were actually, at least nominally, governed by a Mughal monarch. Though, of course, he was, for the most part, a prisoner of the Brits for all de facto purposes. And some of his ancestors were prisoners of the Marathas who told him what to do. So the Mughal monarch didn't really exercise genuine power for about 150 years before the monarchy was ended. But that was a symbolic thing. I mean, if the British had never come and we'd evolved into a modern state in those arrangements, we would have probably had a constitutional monarch, some feeble descendant of a Mughal, and we would have probably had, who knows, emerging from a sort of, rather like the Japanese shogunate, a Maratha warrior confederacy might have produced an initially militarized state that then becomes democratized and becomes a version of a modern Asian state. The idea that there's something naturally Hindu about this subcontinent, which always had everyone mixed up together, is hotly contestable. And in fact, it's often pointed out that people forget, for example, how many Muslim soldiers and generals Shivaji had, and how many Hindu soldiers and generals Aurangzeb had. Now, it's always as if the two are fighting against each other. Aurangzeb is this evil sort of Muslim warlord, Muslim fanatic, and Shivaji is this brave Hindu warrior. The fact is they were both leading mixed armies with mixed leaders and generals. And that goes back in many examples. The famous thing that they're trying to rewrite now, the Battle of Haldi Ghati, Maharana Pratap and Akbar. I mean, the fact is that Maharana Pratap's general who was in the field and fought most of the battles was a man called Hakim Khan Sur, a Muslim. And Akbar didn't personally go and descend to fight Maharana Pratap. He sent he sent his Rajput general, who actually led the forces of the Mughals against his fellow Rajput, Maharana Pratap. So you're looking at a situation where history is far more complicated than these retellings actually imply. And these retellings are being told for the purpose of creating a false construct and imposing it on our reality today. Why would you want me to conform to that? That's why I said, I'm all for consensus, not conformity. I'm all for unity, but not uniformity. We are not a monolithic nation. We're not a nation of one narrative, one people, one language, one ethnicity, one religion. Let's accept that that diversity is our great strength. Let's celebrate it. Let's enjoy our pluralism, as we have been doing till 2014.
It almost seems though, as an observation, the idea is not to say that we are a country of one language, religion or identity, but that one language, religion and identity is more Indian than the others are. Because I've seen this on political posters as well that says born Hindu. And this idea has come up saying that everyone who was born in this land was born Hindu and then has chosen to convert. And it's important for people to acknowledge that. Since we have a limited amount of time, I do want to address one thing that came up in your book, which I thought was fascinating. The idea of the NRI, or what you call the expatriate, someone who doesn't live in this country, who has a sort of romantic attachment to the country they once knew, the best parts of it that they do remember, and how that is part of their sort of mixed their identity. And I've always found it very interesting that people who live overseas in other countries of Indian origin or NRIs, non-resident Indians, want to be treated equally by those countries, but still consider a sort of hierarchy in our own country. And where does that actually then, reconcile to this whole idea of nationalism or patriotism and how we understand each other?
And it's further complicated by the fact that you have the expatriate extremist on the one hand, who is busy actually supporting some of the most extreme ideas in the homeland he's left. And you have the expatriate nostalgic on the other, who, as you say, has this cherished idea of this perfect place that he was forced to leave by economic circumstances or whatever. And this complication is enormous. In fact, I've written about this with feeling in many parts of the book. I think it occurs in 9 or 10 different places, partly because, of course, I have known expatriation myself for a long time, without ever relinquishing my passport or my nationhood. I did live abroad a very long time. But secondly, because my children, I only have 2 children, and they have both chosen the expatriate life, partially or principally because of the circumstances of their upbringing. And as a result, I have the sense of having lost them to another country. One has, in fact, very recently taken the decision to change his passport. The other one still clings to his Indianness, but for how long, I don't know, because he's also married an American and has produced an Indian child. I'm an American child, so what incentive does he have to stay Indian forever? I have all these concerns about it, but equally I worry about how this works in terms of their relationship to us. We all know that, for example, much of the Khalistani movement was financed by a lot of big dollars coming from expatriate Sikhs in America and Canada. We know that Irish Republicans did the same thing back in Ireland, financed the terrorism of the IRA. We know that Sri Lankan Tamils did that for the Tamil Tigers. Expatriates can go to some pretty desperate extremes, partially because of their guilt at the abandonment of the motherland, mixed with rage that the motherland had somehow forced them to abandon it. And so it's rather like a faithless lover who blames the woman he has spurned for not having sufficiently merited his fidelity. And therefore he supports extremism at home out of nationalist guilt at not being involved in his homeland, and feels that by supporting extremism, he's vindicating his decision to abandon it. Now, that kind of thing really worries me, because obviously we're seeing some of this, and it's particularly ironic that, as you implied in your question, let's say an expatriate in a Western country who is, because of the color of his skin or his own faith or his cultural practices, constantly fearing discrimination and marginalization amongst the mainstream in that society, is busy financing discrimination and marginalization of minorities in the country he's left. I find this, ironic 1,000 times over, but also desperately tragic.
Well, Mr. Tharoor, I've been told we've run out of time, unfortunately. It was a fascinating conversation and it's a fascinating book. I wish you very good luck with everything that you're currently, dealing with.
Thank you so very much, Faye. It's been a stimulating conversation. Trust you to ask all the right probing questions and keep up the great work you do to keep a space alive for creative and free exchanges of knowledge and information in our country. We need it. And I'm sorry you're not still on commercially available mainstream television, but we'll watch you on YouTube if that's what it takes to hear you. All the best.
Thank you, Mr. Tharoor. Back to the team at the Jaipur Lit Fest.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. Thank you, Faye, for that absolutely insightful conversation, and especially coming at the back of the fact that you yourself have been charged with sedition. And thankfully, that's at bay for now. But these are important issues for us to take forward. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. And thanks to our celebration partners, Diageo. Please do stay logged on, and between you can watch sessions between the front lawn and of course the bar hall and everywhere in between. Remember to visit the bookstore, Amazon, online, and of course our craft venue, which is Earth Fables. Do contribute, press that contribute button. I know you're probably sick of me saying this, but we really need help for every dollar and rupees, cent and pound that we can get to continue the free flow of knowledge and ideas, which keeps at bay hatred and ignorance. Please remember to tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021, and our handle is at Jaipur Lit Fest. The festival and all of us here are protected by Dettol. Stay safe, stay masked.